there, and welcome back for another video on APUS history. Today we're tackling topic 3.5, the American Revolution. So as always, we want to stay really closely focused on the learning objective. Explain how various factors contributed to the American victory in the Revolution. So what this means is that we are really going to zone in on the factors leading to the American victory. We're not looking at a lot of the military history. We're not looking at the battles. There's a lot of things that we're going to skip over. This simply isn't going to be an all-encompassing American Revolution video. Rather, it will be really in-depth on these various factors. So we want to pay attention to the curriculum framework from the College Board, which talks about how there was Loyalist opposition and Britain had an advantage over the United States. Yet, the Patriot cause succeeded because of four things. And those four things are going to be the heart of this outline. So we're going to look at some historical context and the opposing sides, looking at the actual advantages that Britain had. We're going to detail the Loyalist opposition, and then we're going to dive into the four main reasons for victory and conclude with the terms of the Treaty of Paris. So historical context, what do you need to remember before we dive into this lesson? Well, the first shots are fired at Lexington and Concord. So as the colonists and the British were spying on each other, the British learned of the location of the supplies of the colonists, the military supplies. And so on their way to seize these supplies, there were the first shots fired. Next comes the Battle of Bunker Hill, which actually happens on Breed's Hill, where the colonists had fortified some areas around Boston and the British attacked them there. Now, the colonial militia did have to abandon their fortifications. However, there were so many casualties to the British that it led to a lot of morale boost for the early colonial army. Then we see the publications of Common Sense and the writing of the Declaration of Independence. These are laying the philosophical foundations and are really important for convincing more Americans to support the patriot cause. So some basic colonial characteristics at the time, there's 2.6 million people. And of that 2.6 million, about 40% were called patriots, 20 to 30% loyalists, and the rest would have been considered neutral at the start of the war. So let's dive into the opposing sides here. Looking at the strengths, weaknesses, and strategies of the United States. The strengths of the United States are kind of hard to measure. They had the familiarity of home ground, the leadership of George Washington, and they were inspired by the cause for independence. It's hard to measure how that is going to be an advantage, but we do know that being familiar with the territory, having a strong leader, and having a vision and a cause that you can fight for are all going to be helpful in the war effort. Now, weaknesses. We know that their soldiers haven't had the experience of the British. They barely have a navy. They're going to run short of food and ammunition and other supplies because, as you remember, their trade was dependent on Great Britain. Additionally, the government that they form under the Articles of Confederation is going to really limit their ability to run a war effort. So what are their strategies? It's a war of attrition. It's a war where they're going to just try to wear down Great Britain. So they're going to play defense. They are going to just try to wait it out, try to last as long as they can, fight in a different way than Britain is used to, obtain European allies to help them so that eventually Great Britain just decides it's not worth fighting anymore. Okay, let's shift gears to Great Britain here. Now, we have a little more measurable information here. Their military was 400% larger. They were stronger and more well-trained. They had a very successful navy, a stronger government, significantly more available funds. They will have the support of Loyalists and Native Americans and the manufacturing to be able to make the war supplies. So what makes the war difficult for Great Britain? One of the biggest things will be the long supply lines. It's going to take a very long time for the supplies and the troops to get from Britain to North America. Additionally, information going back to Parliament and the King will be outdated by the time it gets there. Being unfamiliar with the territory, their leaders aren't as strong. Certain British politicians were more lenient or sympathetic to the American cause, and they had a difficult time enlisting soldiers, because in Britain at this time you enlisted for life, and so it was difficult to convince people to do that. So they had to hire soldiers from other countries. So their strategy is going to be to divide and conquer. They have a much stronger loyalist support in the South, and so they're going to try to divide the colonies and really utilize that loyalist opposition. They are going to not only encourage rebellions by enslaved persons, but they are also going to offer freedom to enslaved persons who fight for the British. And then the blockading of ports with their navy will play a really important role in limiting the trade of the United States. So now let's dive in a little bit more to the Loyalist opposition. As we already mentioned, that about 20 to 30% of the whole colonial population will consider themselves to be Loyalists, and about 60,000 will actively fight for or support the British. So some of the things that Loyalists care about is they may not actually be all that fond of Britain. However, they believe that they should use the measures that are within the British Constitution to find a solution rather than seek independence. Another major factor for their loyalty to Britain is going to be that they fear the economic ramifications of leaving Britain. Things like the protection of the Navy, the guaranteed market for their goods, the fact that they have to pay taxes, but they're lower than the British pay in Britain. And so all of these things make them leery about forming a new country, especially forming a brand new government. So another thing that factors into the Loyalist opposition is the fact that the patriots, the ones that were gaining a lot of the media, weren't exactly acting in a way that encouraged Loyalists to be part of it. For example, they believed their behavior was treasonous. They were engaging in dangerous actions, and the patriots were harassing loyalists. There was tarring and feathering going on. There was the confiscation of property. All of these things didn't make the patriot cause all that inviting, really. When we think about the fact that American Indians were often supportive of the Loyalist cause, is because they believed the British were more likely to protect their lands. You can think back to the Proclamation of 1763, which prevented or tried to prevent the British colonists from moving out to the West. And so many, like the Iroquois Confederacy, the Cherokee, sided and fought for the British. And as I already mentioned, enslaved persons were promised freedom for supporting the British, so many did fight alongside the British. One of the most famous Loyalists is actually Ben Franklin's son, William. This is the fact that William becomes a Loyalist, ends up being it causes a severing in the relationship between Ben Franklin and his son William. This image here is the arrest of William Franklin for being a Loyalist. So what are some of the ways that Loyalists behaved? What are some of the things that they did during the war? Well, they published some pamphlets. One of the most famous ones was called Plain Truth, which you can think about the fact that Thomas Paine's was called Common Sense. It's playing off of his title. And it really was the counter argument, saying that this book, Common Sense, isn't actually common sense. As I already mentioned, the Loyalists during the war are going to face physical attacks, harassment, confiscation of their property. But they do contribute in a large way to the war effort. Anywhere between 19,000 and 50,000 actually served as soldiers in the British Army, but they had other roles as well. Spies were very common. Writers like James Chalmers, they actually wrote a Loyalist Declaration of Independence. They acted in subversive ways, trying to prevent the activities of the protest groups prior to the Revolutionary War, and also to dismantle the efforts of the Continental Army. Additionally, preachers would use their pulpits to espouse the British, to show their support for them and try to convince their congregation to also support the British. So here's a quote by a Loyalist. By a reconciliation with Britain, an end would be put to the present calamitous war, by which many lives have been lost, and so many more must be lost if it continues. So, another cause for the Loyalist opposition was simply trying to prevent the loss of life and all the destruction that follows naturally in a war. So we're going to move on now to the four major reasons for the victory. So first, we're going to look at some of the actions of the colonial militias and the Continental Army. So anywhere from 200,000 to 350,000 people served in the military. However, it was really no more than 25,000 at the same time. So this fact of constantly having turnover within the military proved to be a very big challenge for Washington and the other officers. So here are a few groups of people that were part of the military. So one of the more famous is going to be the Minutemen. These are typically farmers. Sometimes they are known as citizen soldiers who would be ready at a minute's notice. The Continental Army has been known as a ragtag group, a patchwork. Many of the people in the Continental Army were indentured servants, poor criminals trying to avoid jail time or exchanging jail time for service in the army. And they did become more trained than the Minutemen. And then additionally, even though Britain offered freedom to African Americans also fought for the Continental Army. They saw an alignment between the values of freedom for enslaved people and freedom for the American people from Britain. And Washington was very, very reluctant to have African Americans join the military. It wasn't until about 1780 that he allows for them to become part of the army. So next I want to discuss the roles of women. One of the most common roles for women in the Revolutionary War was the camp follower. So they would follow along with the soldiers as they moved from battle to battle, and they would care for the soldiers, feed them, nurse the wounded, that sort of thing. Some women occasionally fought. So the most well-known would have been Deborah Sampson. Once she was found out for being a woman, she was honorably discharged, but other women would step in. So they were camp followers. One was called Captain Molly. So her husband was assisting a gunner during a battle. The man was killed. Her husband, John, stepped in, and then he was killed. And with no time to mourn, Captain Molly stepped in and did that role. Additionally, some women worked as spies. Now, this isn't proven, but General Thomas Gage was married to an American woman, and there is some people who believe that she actually acted as a spy and was able to do that very effectively because of her close connection to the general. Some women raised money. In fact, some women raised up to $300,000, and that is in the Revolutionary era amount of money. Producing army clothing was another common task, and harvesting land or taking over businesses for people that were enlisting in the army was another common role. So here's a few images. There you can see a woman, a patriot with a gun. Next up is an image of the camp followers. So you can see the military packing up and the women and children following behind. We've got here a man named William Armistead, who was a assistant to the French officer, the Marquis de Lafayette, who was helping in the war, and he acted actually as a double agent. So he supported the Patriot cause after he had infiltrated the British Army. Next, we have a combination of military uniforms that you would have seen, different people supporting the Patriot Army. A lot of people just believe that the Patriots were blue, but that is not the case, as the Army had to just kind of deal with what they could in the moment. So let's continue on and talk about just a couple key moments of the war. So one of the major turning points is called the Battle of Saratoga. So the Battle of Saratoga is a surprising military victory for the Americans. And what that did was it enabled Benjamin Franklin, who was acting as a diplomat in France, to negotiate a formal treaty of alliance with France. This was a huge moment where the Americans were able to to gain more supplies, more troops, and especially the Navy to support in the war effort against Britain. The winter at Valley Forge was also really significant during the war. It was just a brutal winter where a quarter of the Continental Army actually died from malnutrition, exposure, etc. However, near the end of the winter, a Prussian officer, Baron von Steuben, and the French officer I previously mentioned, the Marquis de Lafayette, actually helped to train the troops. And so, despite the fact that Washington tried to avoid the traditional battle styles that the British were very successful at, they did have to do this sometimes. And so the training provided by these two Europeans significantly helped the Americans to come out of Valley Forge actually stronger than before the winter. Another final moment that you should be aware of is the Battle of Yorktown. And this is going to be the last major battle of the Revolutionary War. So Lord Cornwallis had taken the British Army to Yorktown and was hoping to be able to get resupplied there. The French Navy blockaded it, and Washington's troops made a very quick 450-mile march where they were able to lay siege to the city, and eventually Lord Cornwallis does surrender. So some of the tactics, thinking about the actions of the colonial militia and the army, are all about the guerrilla tactics and the defensive strategy. So they tried to stay really focused on that strategy of the war of attrition, wear down the army. And so what the Continental Army would do is they would retreat through dense forests, which was much more difficult for the large British Army and all of their supplies. So that would lead to more exhaustion. Oftentimes, the Americans would fight behind barriers rather than in the open field, and they engaged in hit and run tactics. All of these things were seen as almost unethical by the British, but it allowed for them to be more successful than if they had tried to fight in the traditional style of war. So let's move on to the second reason for victory, and that's George Washington's military leadership. Washington ends up becoming the symbol of the American cause. And really, there are many historians that cite a variety of reasons for his leadership position. Some discuss his physical size, his energy, his charisma, his courage, his temperament, the fact that he was from Virginia. But ultimately, most people believe it is his moral character. He's not known as being incredibly intelligent. However, he was very ethical and treated people with respect. He also was a great example of a visionary leader. He was able to inspire the troops to continue to fight despite things like the Winter of Valley Forge, when in most circumstances people would have deserted. And there certainly were deserters, but not nearly what would have happened without the inspiration provided by General Washington. All of his work with the military, his presence, his character, it really captured the trust and love of soldiers and civilians, and it allowed for the United States to last through the entire war. So next, we want to look at the colonists' ideological commitment and resilience. And to look at this, I'm actually going to have you just look at a brief excerpt from two letters. So this first one is from Edmund Dickinson, and he's writing a letter to his sister. He says, "Dear girl, I embrace this opportunity to communicate a few sentiments to you, as well as inform you of the joy circulating through our camp at the glorious news from France, which I make no doubt has reached your city by this time. 'Tis no less than an offer of alliance from France and Spain on the most honorable terms possible. I make not the least doubt, but it will cause a peace before the leaves, which are just now budding out here, falls from their tender sprigs." So this is from the camp at Valley Forge, and this is after the winter there. So you can sense this joy and happiness despite the fact that they have just suffered through this very long winter. So next up, we have a letter from an officer in the Continental Army, Alexander Scammell, and he says, "Brother Phillips, tyranny and oppression yield their iron rod over our country. They begin to shake the very foundation of our Constitution, and the voice of our forefathers' blood cries to us from the ground to define the rights, the liberty, and the territory which they so dearly purchased. Every man of true honor and virtue will rather contend for the honor of first spilling his blood in so glorious a cause. So here you can see how this officer is trying to convince his friend to join the military. So their commitment, their resilience despite difficulties plays a huge part in securing the victory in the Revolutionary War. So our last reason for victory is really important. It is the assistance by European allies. So they have a variety of reasons for wanting the North American colonies to succeed in their independence, embarrassing the British, reducing their power, but ultimately a large reason is the economic opportunity. France and Spain both want greater access to North America, which Britain was limiting. So Benjamin Franklin plays a really important role in securing the Treaty of Alliance with France, also known as the Franco-American Alliance. This secured supplies and funds, and really important was the Navy along the Atlantic coast. Spain will declare war on Britain shortly after this Treaty of Alliance. They also provide food, or they also provide funds, food, etc. They also smuggle additional supplies in, and a major role for the Spanish is going to be their efforts along the Mississippi River. So they were able to kind of close in, divide up the military, the British military on two coasts without also having to divide up the American military. So the American Revolution really becomes a world war as France, Britain, and Spain don't just fight in North America, but also in the Mediterranean and the Caribbean, the English Channel. So here you can see our George Washington and the Marquis de Lafayette, and it's really kind of showing this French and American alliance that was taking place. So last topic here is going to be the Treaty of Paris that concludes the war. So in 1780, John Jay, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, they're sent to Paris to negotiate this treaty. After Yorktown, the British delegates finally agreed to draft a treaty. So here are the major terms that you should be aware of. First, the United States is independent. Britain will recognize that. The western border, it will be the Mississippi River, Canada in the north, Spain will have Florida, and the U.S. will continue to have fishing rights off of Canada. The Americans will pay back their debts and will honor Loyalist property confiscations, and the British will leave North America. So those are the major terms of the treaty. Here's an unfinished painting, but you can see the members of this delegation sent to negotiate this treaty. And here you can see are the pre-war and post-war boundaries. Clearly, the United States did not exist in 1775 and now does exist in the map in 1783. So there you have it. There's your lesson on explaining how various factors contributed to the American Revolution or the American victory in the Revolution. I hope that this was really helpful for you. And of course, if it was, I would appreciate a like and subscribe.